guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, "Neighbor Stole Part of My Property and Built a Private Pool on My Land." I'm here today to share my story regarding my elderly mother's shitty neighbors so that no one else has people taking advantage of them the way that these people did her. When my father died, I moved back into my childhood home to help take care of my mother. They had owned their country house for over 30 years, raising myself, my two brothers and sister in it since we were toddlers. It was a beautiful home that had slowly lost some of its curb appeal as my mother can no longer weed the flower beds and tend to the yard. Shortly before Dad passed and I moved in, I had noticed during my few visits that their newer neighbors had been parking some trailers in my parents' yard. I didn't do anything about it because Mother said that she allowed it to happen because they had been cutting the grass for her for several months and it was essentially a favor. Fine, I let it slide. So, I started the process of moving in and it took me about a month because I didn't previously live that close. Once I got settled, I went over and met with the gentleman that lived there with his wife and two kids to introduce myself. His name was Greg and he seemed like a decent enough guy. The conversation went fine and before I departed back to the house I casually asked him if he could perhaps move the trailer back to his property since I will be taking care of things for my mother now. He paused and scoffed, acting like I was asking him to do something that I had no right to. I told him that while my mother and I appreciated his temporary help, she would no longer be needing it and I was planning on putting up a fence, so his trailer needed to be moved. This statement caused Greg's neck to grow red and his face hardened with anger, but his words were still cordial. "Oh, just give me a few days and I'll have the trailers moved." As I was getting ready to walk back home he said something else from behind me, "You know, a fence is just going to look ugly. You might as well leave it as it is. The country is meant to be open and free after all." I chuckled at his statement and told him that we would see before going in for dinner. Lo and behold, the trailers weren't moved after a few days, but I didn't have time to deal with it. That same week I was on a conference call when I became distracted by the sound of a lawnmower close to the house. When I finished with my work I went outside to see that the neighbor had cut his yard all the way up to about 20 feet from our house. This was strange because their property ended about a half an acre further over. When I think back on everything, I realize that things would have been easier if me and especially my mother had stopped them from encroaching illegally onto our land the first time we noticed it. Unfortunately though, my mother is a non-confrontational person and I was honestly very busy and distracted at the beginning after losing my father and having to move halfway across the state. The evening I noticed that Greg had clearly cut the grass way over our property line, so I approached him again. "Hey Greg, I see that you cut some of our yard. While I appreciate it, it's honestly not necessary." He was sitting outside on his back deck drinking a beer and listening to some shitty music while he grilled their dinner. "Oh, well I had forgotten where the line was so I just went to where I thought our property ended." I squinted my eyes at him, knowing that this was a bunch of BS. His trailer was still on our property and he knows that, therefore, he knows damn well where the property divide is. "Okay, for the future, the property line is around here," I pointed out to him. "Having a fence will solve this issue." While I wasn't trying to be rude, it was quite apparent that I wasn't happy with Greg. That next week I had to unfortunately travel out of town for work and my mother was home alone. I received a frantic phone call from her one evening. She was saying that there was someone outside walking around near the windows and back door, so I told her to call 911 right away. Thankfully, my Doberman, Enzo, was there to somewhat protect her. She called me back about an hour later to tell me that the police couldn't find anyone lurking around but there were footprints in the back flower bed that seemed to be coming from the neighbors. The police were willing to go over and speak with them but Mother didn't want to stir up trouble. This made me grumble under my breath. Greg needs a good scare, goddammit. The police would have been perfect. But again, my mother hates confrontation. When I returned home, I made speaking with Greg my top priority. But I was stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed that there was excavating being done in their backyard, and mine. I approached him and the crew of workers. My face must have been red and angry looking because Greg immediately seemed to appear nervous. "What the hell do you think you are doing? I asked hotly, to which Greg just seemed to look away and stare at the work being done instead of answering me honestly. Hey buddy, just putting in a pool. It's always been a dream. I cut him off, as I was even more pissed listening to his bullshit. I don't give a shit if it's a dream to put in a pool. It's not on your fucking property, Greg. His head snapped towards me so hard I thought it might break. I don't think that he expected me to have much to say or what, but he was clearly surprised by my response. I got close to him. My mother might have let you get away with snooping around and parking on her land, but now I'm here and this isn't going to fly. I walked away abruptly but shouted back one more thing. This needs to be gone and filled back in by Friday. From there, I went to work on finding a real estate attorney and a property surveyor. The surveyor came out the next day and was quick to comment on the partially dug pool that was encroaching onto our land. I was even surprised to find out that our property line is even further towards their house than I had always thought, meaning they were even more in the wrong. This made me realize that they had also removed trees that were not on their property. This prompted me to do a full examination of the land at this point, finding more and more things that just pissed me off. Apparently they had been dumping tires and trash behind an old barn at the back of our property, amounting to hundreds of dollars worth of clean-up needing to be done. Not only that, but the trees they had removed were old and mature maple and black walnut trees. The surveyor recommended that I have an arborist come out to assess the damage they had done there as well. After all of the inspections were said and done, the more terrible the neighbors appeared. Over the last year, before I moved in, they had built a chicken coop and extended their driveway on our property. This is a problem. Before the surveyor left, he had a team come out and mark our property corners with purple-capped rebar wires. I then took the information I had to Greg, who didn't want to hear from me at all. When I stepped onto his land, he immediately started telling me to leave and that I was trespassing. That was rich coming from him. I told him from a distance that I had the land surveyed and that he would be receiving documents in the mail stating what he needed moved or there would be legal repercussions. Instead of doing that though, he proceeded to shove the rebar wires into the ground and completely disregard the obvious property line I was trying to establish. When my fencing crew came, they couldn't set up because the markers were gone. Throughout the week, Greg continued to park where I asked him not to and left his trailers on my land and his half-built pool. I contacted my lawyer, wanting to be sure of what my legal rights were at this point. He told me that the documents had been given to him legally and that he has been informed by my attorney and the surveyor of where the correct and established property line is. At this point, I had the right to take action if I wanted to. So, I contacted a tow company and had all of their vehicles and trailers on my property removed and impounded. I also had his partially dug pool filled back in with dirt. I would have moved the chicken coop too, but I didn't want to bring fear or harm to the birds. Hopefully Greg would do it himself and take the ducking hint. Greg was livid but knew he had no leg to stand on. The best he could do was give me shitty looks from his side of the property while the fencing crew came to install the 7-foot privacy fence. This also meant that he had to move his coop and his driveway over, which was no easy feat for him. Greg made a sad attempt at intimidating me by threatening to sue us, but I then proceeded to show him how much money he owed us for the trees he illegally removed, the trash cleanup behind the barn and the fencing costs. Let's just say that he dropped it pretty quickly. It turned out that Greg couldn't hack the embarrassment and the frustration of living next to someone who made him look like a property-stealing asshole, and he and his family moved away. I ended up purchasing the home and land from the company that bought it off of him, and now I rent it out to my brother and his family. Things are great now, and we did end up building a badass in-ground pool, but this time not right in the middle of both yards. Figured that would make it a little hard to sell later if it was. The next story is entitled Cousin demands his dying mother rewrite her will so he gets his fair share. After living rent-free in the home for over 4 decades, got his karma, kinda. Never posted before, but I had to share the story of my white trash cousin. We will call him Chad. His would be the picture next to entitled in the dictionary, all 400+ pounds of him. He found out that his mother had stage 4 throat cancer and there was nothing the doctors could do to help her at that point, so naturally his response was to get angry when she asked his youngest sibling to come take care of her during her final days. His father had a stroke years ago. Karma got him, and this sibling would be given the house after their mother died to be able to continue caring for their dad. Chad was furious that the house wasn't going to be sold and he get his fair share from the sale. To lay some background, Chad was over 45, never lived outside his parents' home, expected his mother to cook, clean, do his laundry, etc. without paying a single dime toward rent, utilities, etc. He spent the money he earned on whatever he wanted, usually food, hence his huge size. When he found out that his mother wasn't going to change her will and was going to give the house and everything in it to the youngest sibling, he threatened to burn the house down after barricading the exits from outside so that no one could get out. He thought he had the police in his town in his back pocket, but when my mom heard the threat, she got his mom to record what was said. When it was played for the police department, they had no clue who Chad was and promised if anything like that happened at the address given he would be their first arrest. To show how ungrateful this cousin was, he went out and got dinner for the family at a fast food place and then stood over his mom in her hospice bed with his hand out until she paid him back for dinner. Most of which he ate, since his father eats hardly anything and his mother was fed through a tube in her stomach because she couldn't swallow anymore due to the throat cancer. When she died, it took way too long for his sibling to get him out of the house, but he finally left and found his own place. Here is where the karma came to bite him, kinda. He was working somewhere that they would direct cars where to go and the poor older man in the car he was motioning hit the gas instead of the brake and slammed Chad into the parked car behind him, messing up his legs from the knees down. A few months later, he was back in the hospital because his diabetes was out of control and he hadn't taken care of his legs like he should have. They almost had to amputate them at the knees, but the doctors were good at their jobs and saved his legs, unfortunately. Now he got a huge settlement from where he worked and can afford to have his whims catered to still. Yes, I know I'm mean about wanting him to lose his legs, but he needs to know what his mother felt, the helplessness she experienced in her final days, while he sat in his room watching porn. He was a horrible brother to his youngest sibling and a terrible cousin, so he deserves to suffer for his "give me what I want because I want it now" attitude. I am completely no contact with him and his oldest brother, because they are scum. The fact the other siblings turned out to be productive and wonderful humans is due to their wonderful mother's love and teaching. I miss her every day. She was like a second mom to me, who explained all the things mine didn't in order to protect me from the evils of sex, but that's another story. The next story is entitled Person Demand an Apology because our driver passed him when he was biking. So, this didn't happen to me but to our driver. My mom does buy and sell, and her customers are our neighbors. My dad bought a small delivery van to use as the heaviest product my mom sells is sacks of rice. Some of our neighbors would come to our house and get the things they bought, but some opted for delivery. So our driver would pack the things in the van and do door-to-door delivery. We also live in a gated exclusive community. My mom said that it was happenstance that the value of the land went down when they were looking for a place to move, so they got the land here cheap. Still, since it is an exclusive gated community, we have politicians, TV personalities and business owners as neighbors. Some are expats who decided to immigrate here and/or married someone who lived here. The streets are also not flat, kinda like how San Francisco streets are like, so a lot of people like to take walks or bike, hence the low speed limit. Incidentally, there is no bike trail on every road except if you're in the parks. So if you want to bike and cruise while looking at the huge houses, you have to stay on the side near the sidewalk so you don't hog the road and of course, for safety. Our driver was doing his typical delivery, staying well within the speed limit of 40 miles per hour. Someone was on their bike in front of him but on the side, and the roads here are quite wide. He's coming up to an elevated road, so he has to increase his speed to compensate, plus the sacks of rice at the back of the car. By increasing his speed, he passed the person on the bike. Now I'm not sure in other countries, but here, we honk to the vehicle in front to tell them you're overtaking so they will stay in their lane. So our driver let out one honk to say, "Hi, I'm right behind you, I'm passing, please excuse me." It's not the actual interpretation, but you get the idea. So he passed the guy on his bike and thought nothing of it. Until we got a call from the admin saying that a resident came forth to complain against the person driving the van, gave the van's plate number. The guy was complaining and demanding an apology from our driver, and how dare our driver to overtake him. When I heard the story, I was thinking, okay, the road was on an incline and he's on his bike. What does the guy expect our driver to do, wait behind the bike? At the start of the story, I was thinking that our driver may have bumped into the bike and caused an accident our driver didn't notice. But no, the van didn't bump into the bike. Like I mentioned above, the roads are wider compared to public roads. And our driver stayed within the lane. Yeah, he's going more than 40 miles per hour, but that was before he claimed the inclined road. Once he passed it, he stayed within the speed limit. The guards also didn't see anything wrong. The overtaking was okay and the guy on the bike wasn't injured at all. The van has cameras at the front and back and my sister checked. The next bit I heard a few days later. Apparently, the guy on the bike feels that our driver doesn't have any right to overtake him. Like what? Our family thinks that maybe since our driver was wearing faded clothes, he's also fixing our laundry room so he's wearing old clothes, and doesn't look like a homeowner, he can bully our driver into a law he can invent. The last story is titled, Return of K. Mom, can you pay my rent through the end of 2022? Disclaimer. All names below have been changed. This story occurs on my wife's side of the family, so I have a second row seat rather than a front row for most of this. My wife's Aunt Louise is a great lady. She and her husband lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and bought their home in the late 1970s. After her husband passed a few years ago, she sold her home for over $1 million and moved back to live closer to her family where she grew up, farming areas in Southern California. She's in her late 60s. Aunt Louise had 3 children, who are now all in their 40s. The 2 oldest are nice, normal people. Her youngest, Kay, is a real piece of work. She meets all the criteria for a psychological diagnosis of narcissism. This is just one of literally dozens of stories I could tell. We were visiting my wife's family over Labor Day weekend when I heard of this little nugget. Kay divorced her husband expecting a windfall, but their constant refinancing and continuous cashing out on his retirement meant she didn't get much money. I heard it was about $10,000. So, she's been running to her mom, my wife's Aunt Louise, for help. A couple months ago, after floating her more than $20,000 in loans that were never repaid, Aunt Louise wrote a check for $10,000, telling Kay that was it. There was no more assistance coming. Last week, Kay asked Aunt Louise to pay her rent through 2022. This is the same Kay who has resumed her smoking and drinking habits, plus is a regular at the local dispensary. While I don't care about people's indulgences, when you demand others pay for them, you're crossing a line in my eyes. Out of curiosity, we went through Kay's Facebook page where we find pictures from 2 vacations. Apparently, she needed to get away from the stress of sitting around her house, no job since 2017 to 2018, while drinking and smoking. We didn't get this from Aunt Louise, so I don't know her take. But Louise's sons, Kay's brothers, and the sources for this story, are feeling absolutely murderous about the whole thing. Thank you for listening.